Welcome back to Good Morning Europe. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan calls for a boycott on French products have had strong support from several majority Muslim states. There have been protests in Libya and Bangladesh following the French President Emmanuel Macron making a defence of France's secular values. In an escalating war of words between the two leaders, Macron said the country would never give up its cartoons, a reference to the caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad that were published several times in a satirical magazine and shown to his students by the history teacher who was beheaded in a violent attack outside Paris earlier this month. That prompted the French authorities to intensify a crackdown on radical Islamism. Louise Miner reports.
There have been angry protests in northern Syria, outside the French embassy in Baghdad and in Pakistan. It's after the French president's controversial defence of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad and vowed not to give up these type of cartoons. Visual representation of the Prophet is strictly forbidden in Islam.
We want to inform the French president, do not interfere in our religion, do not insult our religion. We respect every religion and all prophets, including Jesus. We respect all, and we do not want him to act in a way that can offend Muslims.
Emmanuel Macron's comments came in response to the beheading of Samuel Paty, comments he defends on the basis of the right to free speech. The teacher had shown cartoons of the Prophet during a class he was holding on free speech. Meanwhile, the Turkish president joined calls for a boycott of French goods. Products have been pulled from the shelves in parts of the Arab world such as Yemen, Qatar, Algeria and Kuwait. Meanwhile, tensions are also increasing between Turkey and the European Union. The European Commission urges Turkey's president not to derail the bloc's attempts at renewed dialogue.
If tensions keep increasing with provocations against the European Union or a member of the European Union, then we're going to think about what we can do about such actions or any statements.
The increased pressure hasn't helped Turkey's negotiations on joining the EU, discussions which began in 2005 but have stood still recently. And ties with France have been strained over Syria, Libya and Ankara's gas exploration in the eastern Mediterranean. Louise Miner, Euronews.
Jonathan Lawrence is a professor of political science at Boston College in the US. He's also the author of Integrating Islam, Political and Religious Challenges in Contemporary France. He says President Emmanuel Macron must bring some concrete solutions to the table.
I think that President Macron is facing a challenge that several other French presidents have faced, and that it is time for him to really bring some concrete solutions to the table. Secularism, as you said, is a sacred value in France, has been for over a century. But the French population has changed, and the demography of France needs to be reflected now in the institutions that exist to facilitate religious freedom in France. Now, freedom of expression is always going to be sacrosanct, but it is also time for France to find space for Islam in its institutional landscape. Well, there is something called the French Council for the Muslim Faith, which has existed since around 2003. It has not been equipped with the institutions that would actually help foster a French Islam. It is true that a lot of imams are still imported, that the financing for mosques is still coming from abroad, but that's largely because France has not used the policies that it does have to facilitate religious observance to help French Muslims anchor their institutions in France itself. Right now, they are forced to import imams from other countries because there are no seminaries in France to train imams for deployment in the French countryside.
Farid Khosrowshahi is a retired professor at Paris's School of Higher Studies in Social Sciences, also a sociologist and expert on radical Islam, and joins me now from outside Paris. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Look, in France, secularism has been such an integral part of society for well over 100 years in France now. How do you defend it without exacerbating some of the problems that we've been reporting on?
the problem is that nature of secularism, laïcité, has changed during the last 30 years. I mean, in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a kind of relaxed, serene laïcité, and now it has become a kind of civil religion. And so it is not the same laïcité. Laïcité was, restricted to the state. That means those civil servants who were working for the state should not wear any kind of insignia, religious insignias, and behave in a neutral manner. Now it has been extended, to the civil society, and so it has become a kind of civil religion. It's not the same type of laïcité as in the 1970s. So the problem is that we have, on the one side, Islamic fundamentalism, and on the other side, you have this sort of more coercive laïcité and its frontality. So, on the other hand, we have around 5 million Muslims. We don't know exactly their numbers because it's forbidden by law to count them. But these Muslims who are in a majority of colonial background, they come from North Africa, which were French colonies, feel that they are more and more stigmatized through the new laws and through the new restrictions imposed on them in the name of laïcité.
So what are the president's options? Because he's fiercely trying to defend the right to freedom of expression, the fact that France is a secular country. I know that you've defined it in a different vein there. How can it be that France's different traditions and religions live alongside each other?
The problem is that, defending secularism and defending, let's say, blasphemy laws is true all over Europe. All over Europe, blasphemy is free. No European country, no major West European country, forbids blasphemy. So why is it so frontal in French case? That is the problem to be put to the state authorities, because one way is to declare the freedom of blasphemy, which is true in France and in all over Europe, and the other one is to, in a way, to exacerbate it, to encourage that. And the discourse of the president of the French Republic, has been perceived by many people in the Muslim world and partly in France as being a kind of exhorting, people to use this right, and that is the major problem.
That's a real difference, though. The president isn't talking about exacerbating it, but just defending it. While that's the situation at play, a very tense one, a really controversial situation, what type of solutions could be put in place so that these two, sometimes competing different interests, can be held together?
The French president, of course, defended the right to blasphemy. But at the same time, the pictures of the caricatures were projected onto public buildings. So that it is a major problem how to tackle this problem of blasphemy. And French political culture is much more frontal than other Europeans. Many other European countries have the same, large minority of Muslims. And my guess is that they don't take into account the susceptibilities of the Muslims. One way is, as I said, to defend laïcité, which is a very good thing for France and I think for the modern world. And the other one is how to expose a kind of frontal new way of looking at laïcité as a civil religion. And my guess is that the problem is much more French than European. It has to be tackled, in that respect too.
And that is the debate that is ongoing in France right now. Thank you very much for your analysis. Farhad Khosrow-Kavar, retired professor at Paris' School of Higher Studies and also sociologist and expert on radical Islam. Really appreciate